Thank you. So we're going to make a little sound level. How's this? Not too boomy? Sounds huge from my end, but we got a big room here. So I'm going to get to do the thing I most love to do in the world, which is to interact with people around the issue of mindfulness. And we're going to have a special emphasis on the role that mindfulness would play with regards to emotion. So one of the salient features of mindfulness is that it allows us to divide our sensory experience into natural components, atoms, so to speak, and then track how those atoms interact to create complex phenomena, and also be very cognizant of the role of change, impermanence, that the basic nature of those sensory atoms is in fact not particle, but wave. So what would be some natural sensory components that would be involved in the experience of emotion? Emotion is a little bit of an ambiguous word. Sometimes emotion means something we express on the outside. But we're going to try to be a little more precise and talk about emotional experience. So when we have an emotional experience, which could be pleasant, unpleasant, a mixture thereof, intense or subtle, what would be some of the sensory atoms that you would think would be involved in that experience? Now I'm going to take your questions, but I also like to ask questions. Interactive, you might have heard that. So what would be some of the sensory components that might be involved in an experience of emotion? Start naming. You can just say it out loud, blurt it out. Huh? Body sensations? Is it true? When we have an emotional experience, particularly if it's strong, there's no doubt there are body sensations. That's part of the sensory gestalt. Okay. Anything else? I'm sorry? A heartbeat would come under the category of body sensation, so that's a specific type of body sensation. Well, now feeling is a very ambiguous word in English. It is often used synonymous with emotional experience, although some people would say that the body sensation is the actual felt emotion. It's going to be obvious when I say it. What else? Thoughts. Did someone say thoughts? Is thought part of an emotional experience? Is he said, she said part of what goes on? Do you see the scene? Do you plan your response, etc.? Now, it's interesting. We tend to think of thought as something abstract, but does it make sense to you that thought could be quite tangible and sensory? Because part of thinking is visual. How many people here are aware that at least on occasion you have visual impressions of people, places, objects, and so forth that is part of the thinking process? Raise your hand, okay? Now, there's also mental talk, isn't there? So, now this is interesting because if we look at a picture of emotion spatially, there's a sort of visual component that might happen in front of, behind your eyes. There's an auditory component that's happening in your head, and there's an emotional component that's happening down in your body, an emotional sensation component that's happening in your body. I would suggest to you that these are the three natural sensory components that constitute any adult human being's experience of emotion. Let's coin some words for convenience sake to mean unambiguously visual thought, auditory thought, and emotional body sensation. Now we're going to coin an artificial language, a label language that's going to allow us to keep track of our emotional experience. Our emotional experience is part of what we could call our inner life. So let's use the word in to mean our inner life, inner activation. Since there's a visual component, we'll call mental images see in. The auditory component, mental talk, we'll call it hear in. If you happen to have emotional sensation in your body, we're going to call it feel in. In this case means body, it means a part of your inner life, so feel means your body. So we're going to create this artificial label language that will allow us to track with great precision our emotional experience. And in fact, not just our emotional experience, but our entire inner life. Memory, plan, fantasy, will, desire, emotion, confusion. All of them arise in a kind of inner space. You have a mental image space. For most people, that's in front of, behind your eyes. You have a mental talk space behind that. For most people, that's in the head, at the ears. And then you have your emotional body space, which for many people involves specific centers in the body where emotional sensations tend to be prominent, but broadly also the whole body if you get very strong emotions. The good news when you have strong emotions is you can feel them very tangibly in the body. And if it's really strong, you'll experience it over the whole body. So this gives us some natural atoms. See in, hear in, feel in. Now, this is going to be an experiential workshop. It's also going to be a little bit conceptual, but mostly experiential. So we're going to actually do training here. So training is repetition. It's cellular memory. It's muscle memory. So I'm going to have you repeat after me in a very rote fashion like little kids. We're going to memorize it in the order visual, auditory, somatic. That's just to have an order to memorize. See in, hear in, feel in. Now, does everybody know what I mean by each of those weird phrases? They're very artificial. What does see in mean in this case? Visual thought or mental image. What does hear in mean in this case? Auditory thought or mental talk. What does feel in mean in this case? Yes, or we'll just say the somatic or body component of an emotion. So now let's go over the list. See in, hear in, feel in. You say it. See in, hear in, feel in. See in, hear in, feel in. See in, hear in, feel in. Okay. Now, what are we going to do about see in, hear in, feel in? Well, sometimes it's pleasant, sometimes it's unpleasant. What's on the unpleasant side? Anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, impatience, disgust. What's on the pleasant side? Interest, joy, love, gratitude, humor, smile. What are we going to do about this? This is part of the richness of being a human being. It's a gift of nature. Our limbic system is Darwin's gift. You understand? I'm using Darwin to mean evolution here. These elements were honed by evolution to motivate and direct our behavior. However, sometimes they end up driving and distorting our behavior. And when they're unpleasant, sometimes they cause us horrific suffering. And even when they're pleasant, sometimes we don't really derive the full fulfillment that is potential. So we would like to have a way of working with our subjective space, our inner life of thought and emotion. I would suggest to you that there are three attentional skill sets, or three attentional skills, that are core to being able to work with see in, hear in, feel in. Those three skills are concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity. So let me tell you a little story. Many years ago, when I had my own center in Los Angeles, one of the residents had some issues around fear, and she wanted to work with that. So what we decided to do was, okay, we're going to go to this amusement park where they have a lot of scary rides, and we're going to get on a scary ride, and I'm going to give you a guided meditation, and we're going to work with your fear. And so we decided to do that, and then the morning that we were going to go do this, when I woke up in the morning, I noticed, guess what? I've got a little fear, okay? So, because I knew the ride that we were going to go on, and it's like really disorienting and scary, okay? And it was like, wow, I myself have some fear. It was subtle. So I started to apply a technique. Whenever I'd get the mental image of the ride crashing, I'd say, see in, and I'd just observe that image, okay? Whenever I'd get the mental talk of, well, you know it's safe, but, well, is it really safe? Okay, because, you know, stuff happens, right? In California, it's like there's accidents. And feel in, so I tracked that. One of the mental images I got was like a newspaper headline, prominent local Buddhist leader killed in freak tragedy. So I started to track this, and so we get in the car and we're driving, and it's getting more and more intense. But I'm just tracking see in, hear in, feel in. And then we see the ride, and it's getting more intense, and it's coming quicker, okay? And then we actually get in the ride, and they sort of like lock you in a lot of different ways into this thing, and I freaked out. It's like, I am out of here. Now, meanwhile, part of me, the teacher that is running on autopilot, still guiding this person. But inside, I'm like really freaking out. So what I noticed was, and this was a real lesson, at the instant when I lost it, at the instant when I said, this is too much, I can't stand this, I'm out of here. At that instant, my ability to keep track, what part was mental image, what part is mental talk, what part is the emotional body, my ability to track that vanished, completely vanished. It was all there. It was there on steroids, okay? It was there really intensely, but I couldn't tell you what part was what. Then it took me about 10 minutes to flail my way back to specificity. But as soon as, once again, I could tell you what part was see in, what part is hear in, what part is feel in, that's when the freak out, the overwhelm went away. You can try this experiment over and over again in your life, and you will see at the moment when you lose it, either in the sense of suffering subjectively or acting inappropriately on the outside, at that moment of overwhelm, there will be a precipitous disappearance of the ability to keep track of those three components. Conversely, as long as you can keep track of them, you actually will not be overwhelmed. Now, the miracle of mindfulness, the good news from the East, is that the ability to keep track of these things is cultivatable. With systematic practice, you can vastly elevate your ability to do that. And that means that, that by merely practicing an attentional skill set, we can vastly reduce the overwhelm due to emotions that people experience. So, as I said, I would suggest to you that there are actually 3 skills involved. One is the clarity piece of learning how to keep track. There's another skill, which is concentration, the ability to stably hold something in attention, the ability to focus on what you deem relevant. In order to, okay, so there's that. Then there is something that in Buddhism we technically call equanimity. That means the ability to allow experience to come and go without push and pull. Now, what you will discover is that when you bring these 3, and each of these skills is cultivatable. If you're willing to put in maybe 10 minutes each day for regular practice on a regular basis, maybe every once in a while do a little bit longer on a retreat or something like that. If it's a reasonable amount of time, if you're willing to allocate that time, you can dramatically elevate these core skills. And they will dramatically change your relationship to your inner world of see in, hear in, feel in. How will that relationship change? Well, for one thing, the uncomfortable emotions will still arise, but they'll cause less suffering. The pleasant emotions will still arise, but they'll deliver more fulfillment. Now, if the core skills, did everybody remember what they were? CCE, concentration, clarity, equanimity. Sensory clarity, concentration, and equanimity is a kind of openness, the willingness to allow these strands to expand and contract without push and pull. So, shall we say it? Concentration, clarity, equanimity. Concentration, clarity, equanimity. Okay. So, when you bring these 3 skills to your emotional experience, suffering gets less, even when the discomfort is there, because sometimes we actually need to experience emotional distress for various reasons. But we can experience that with less suffering. Now, I know this is a very hard concept to sort of wrap your mind around. The notion that you could have pain without suffering. There's a mathematical formula that I'm sort of famous for. It's a linear approximation for anyone with a math background. And it's suffering equals discomfort multiplied by resistance. Resistance is the opposite of equanimity. So the degree to which you fight and interfere with the discomfort, to that degree it causes suffering. So you can, 2 ways to reduce suffering: reduce discomfort, or learn to get into equanimity so that the discomfort can just flow through you. The discomfort level remains the same, but the perceived suffering goes down. What is very much to our advantage is that the exact same equanimity skill brought to pleasant emotion will increase their fulfillment. If you don't push and pull on the natural flow of pleasure, it yields more satisfaction. So when we bring these core skills to our emotional experience, we get a reduction of suffering. Experiences become more poignant but less problematic. Did everyone hear that? It's quite paradoxical sounding. Because we get to have our cake and eat it too. We get to live a rich emotional life, which is part of the richness of being a human. But the uncomfortable parts become more poignant but less of a problem. And the pleasant parts become much more fulfilling. But there's more. When we bring these core skills to mental image, mental talk, emotional body, we can get insight into the true nature of these experiences. I like to compare mindful awareness to a microscope. So, true or false? This hand is made up of billions of little cells. This is not a trick Zen question. True or false? True. Next question, not a trick question. How do you know? How do you know? I would suggest to you that there's two basic answers. My high school biology textbook said so, and I believe it. Or I looked through a microscope and I saw it. And the only reason you believe the high school textbook is someone looked through a microscope and wrote that textbook. So what is a microscope? A microscope is an awareness extending tool. It doesn't change reality, but it allows us to perceive things that are not evident to the naked eye. If we just go with the naked eye, we'll never understand the cell theory of life. We will never understand the germ theory of disease. The coming of mindfulness to the West is analogous for the psycho-spiritual world. It is analogous to the invention of the compound microscope by von Leeuwenhoek back in the 16th, 17th century. I guess, when that happened. The cell theory of life, germ theory of disease, that arose because people had a physical awareness extending tool that allowed them to look at life physically at a very fine level. What mindfulness does is it allows us to look at our senses, specifically our inner world of thought and emotion, our self. It allows us to look at that at a very fine-grained level of magnification, stability, and what you see is what you get. Hands off, that's the equanimity. So it turns out that when you do that long enough and hard enough, you see the microscopic nature, the microscopic level, the microscopic structure of thought and emotion. And it turns out that what thought and emotion are made of is actually what external sight, external sound, and purely physical body sensations are made of. All of consciousness is made of the same stuff. Now, would you like me to tell you what that stuff is? How about that? Shall I tell you what that stuff is? I would love to tell you what that stuff is. But if I tell you what that stuff is, and you don't experience it, then it's just so many words. So the more important thing is to equip you with the core skills that will allow you to actually experience it. In other words, experience the true nature of thought and emotion, the true nature of the self. Now, the other problem with attempting to tell you what that stuff is, first problem is, well, oh, now I heard the answer, so I'm ready to go home and just watch TV and surf the web because now I know. You'll substitute the concept for the experience. So that's like really, really bad because you're not going to derive much nutrition from the menu. Okay, you go to the restaurant and there's a menu and it's got the picture of all this great food. You try to eat the menu, ain't gonna work. You have to order the meal and actually eat the food. You follow my metaphor? So this description, that's the menu. Doing your practice is ordering the meal, and then where that takes you is actually eating the meal. The other problem with me telling you in words what that microscopic nature is that there's about a dozen different ways to describe it, and they don't even sound the same. So it gets really confusing. But let me just throw out a few possibilities. We might call it your true self. We might call it spirit. We might call it the vibrating void. We might call it the nature of nature. We might call it the no self. We might call it the big self. We might call it the elastic self, etc., etc. But whatever you call it, I can promise you that when you actually experience it, it will be the single most important thing that ever happened to you, ever. Knowing this directly, living one day, truly knowing who you are, is better than living 30 years of a relatively happy life without knowing that. It's huge. Mindfulness doesn't just diminish suffering and elevate fulfillment. When applied to thought and body sensation, the mind and the body, it has the potential to cause a paradigm shift within you with regards to the question, who am I? And a consequence of that will be an identity that is not limited to the mind and body anymore. And therefore, a consequence of that will be a kind of spontaneous sense of wanting to serve one's new, larger identity, all of humanity, all sentient beings, indeed, all of creation. And that's where it ends. So we're going to now, that's the theory. Now we're going to actually do the practice. So I've got a bell here. Posture is going to be important. Let me demonstrate. Here's what you don't want to do. Here's what you want to do, but I don't want you to do this, okay? This is going to be comfortable, and this is going to lead you to the Zen lurch, okay? So here is what you do want to do. Your back is not, your rump can touch the back, but your back is freestanding. It's not this concept. And if you need to come a little forward, well, actually your chairs are pretty good. I tested them out beforehand. They're pretty good for meditation. This one actually isn't. But you want the back straight, and then the whole body is sort of settled. Okay, so that's going to be the posture piece, and I'm going to guide you in a period of practice. Won't be too long. Let's see here. We'll start with 3 bells and end with 1. Take a moment to stretch up and settle in. And for just a moment, enjoy the stillness of your body. We're going to explore the world of mental image, mental talk, and emotional body sensation. Most of you will have never done the technique that I'm about to guide, so you'll need to listen quite carefully. There are several subtleties. At any given instant, you may have a mental image, maybe a picture of your surroundings, or a memory, a plan, maybe a fantasy. You may be thinking of a person, or a place, or an object, and there's a visual representation. At any given instant, you may have mental talk, your voice, someone else's voice, monologue, dialogue, clear or inchoate. You may have emotional body sensation. Of course, at any given instant, you might not have any mental image at all. You might not have any mental talk at all. You might not have any body sensation at all, any emotional body sensation at all. The presence of mental image is natural, as is its absence. The presence of mental talk is natural, as is its absence. The presence of emotional body sensation is natural, as is its absence. There is day and night. In the inner life, there is activation and rest. Allow your inner life to activate or deactivate as it wishes. We're not trying to make activation. We're not trying to prevent activation. What are we trying to do? For one thing, we're trying to stay in the subjective world. If you get pulled into external sounds, external sights, or the physical impact on your body, come back to your subjective world. That's your concentration piece for now. We're also trying to be clear. At any given instant, am I having a mental image? See in. Am I having mental talk? Hear in. Am I having emotional sensation in the body? Feel in. We're going to track that. That's your clarity piece. Your equanimity piece is to allow the see in, hear in, feel in to activate and deactivate as it wishes. As much as possible, welcoming each state as it arises. In order to facilitate this process, we'll create a bit of structure. If all you're aware of is a mental image, then focus on that. It might disappear, it might last. If all you're aware of is mental talk, focus on that. It might disappear, it might last. If all you're aware of is emotional body, focus on that. It might disappear, it might last. If two or all three of these are active at the same time, just choose one to focus on. It doesn't matter which. If at a given instant you have no mental image, no see in, no hear in, no feel in, then be aware that your inner world has spontaneously dropped into an all rest state. and abide in that selfless state for as long or as short as it may last. Every couple seconds, you're going to be aware of exactly one of four things. You're going to be aware of looking at a mental image, or you're going to be aware of listening to mental talk, or you're going to be aware of tuning into emotional body sensation, or you're going to be aware that none of those are present. You're in a state of global subjective rest. To repeat, none of these four are to be preferred over the others. They're all good, they're all natural. Notice the effect of the physical senses. When you hear a sound, what effect does that have? Does it trigger a mental image, a mental comment, an emotional body reaction? when a physical sensation arises, such as discomfort, sleepiness, fatigue, do you start thinking about it? What part is see in? What part is hear in? Our concentration piece is to stay in the subjective space. Our clarity piece is to know moment by moment, am I focusing on mental image, mental talk, emotional body? Or the awareness that none of those are present right now. The equanimity piece is to have not a scintilla of preference between these, and to let them come and go without push and pull. At some point, you may get bored and impatient. That comes up as some pattern of mental image, mental talk, and emotional body. At some point, you may find yourself problem solving or fantasizing or remembering, seeing, hearing, maybe feeling, could be involved. At some point, your body will become physically uncomfortable. And you'll have mental and body emotion reactions to that. Will and desire will arise. What part is seeing? What part is hearing? What part is feeling? It's possible that you might have an all-rest experience. At that moment, look carefully. There's no self. No self, no problem. Your seeing, hearing, feeling might coagulate and freeze. That will produce a strong sense of self. On the other hand, your seeing, hearing, feeling might just flow like a river. That will produce another flavor of no self, a kind of flow self. Equanimity is to allow the self to melt and freeze, to melt and freeze, to activate and deactivate without any preference whatsoever. Your concentration piece stay in subjective space. Seeing, hearing, feeling, all rest. Your clarity piece, you know, moment by moment, which of those four you're focusing on. It doesn't matter which. Your equanimity piece is to allow them to come and go without push and pull, to activate and deactivate, to coagulate or melt. Without interference. You're bringing mindful awareness to your inner life, which is the space of all subjective experience, including emotions. Okay, good. You can let go of that intentional technique. If you want to, stretch a little bit and so forth, move a little bit, you can do that. So now we're going to add a little more structure to the technique. You have the option, but not the requirement, to use what we call in mindfulness mental labels. I just had you sort of track your subjective experience. Something you could do to help you track it is when you're focusing on a mental image, you could say to yourself, see in. When you're focusing on mental talk, you could say to yourself, hear in. When you're focusing on emotional body sensation, you could think, feel in. If you have none of these at any given instant, you could think, all rest. All rest means something very specific in this case. It means your mental screen is blank, your head is quiet, and your body is emotionally neutral, all at the same time. Now, if you were listening carefully to the instruction, you know that getting all rest is not the goal with this technique. What is the goal? To apply concentration, clarity, and equanimity to the inner system of see in, hear in, feel in, because this is where the emotions are going to arise, and indeed, this is where the whole self arises. That's the only goal. We're not trying to get one state versus the other. So you have the option, but not the requirement to use a mental label. Now, there's an obvious question that some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute. Mental label, thinking the phrase herein, that's itself herein. So do I label the label? And the answer, what do you think the answer is? Well, maybe you're not sure, but the answer is emphatically no, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for a frustrating, infinite descent into labeling the labeling of the labeling. So the labeling voice is gentle and matter of fact. That induces equanimity. The labeling voice is precise. It's going to be exactly one of 4 phrases every couple seconds. See in, hear in, feel in, all rest. And you know exactly what those refer to. And the labeling voice is fairly continuous. That helps you keep a continuity of concentration. Now, I will repeat it again. Mental labels are an option, not a requirement. But some people find them helpful, some people find they get in the way. The actual procedure that we're using here is called noting. You are noting your subjective experience, visual thought, auditory thought, emotional body. How many people notice that sometimes as soon as you note something, it vanishes? That is not a problem. That, in fact, is an insight into impermanence. Now, having said that, you might be thinking, oh, well, then the goal is to get it to vanish. No, the goal is to allow it to expand and contract as it wishes as part of nature. How many people had an experience where actually for a little while there wasn't much going on? There was an all rest. Raise your hands. Okay. If you look carefully into that experience of all rest, you'll notice there's very little sense of limited identity in that. How many people at least occasionally had a see-in experience? Hear-in. How many people during this sit had feel-in? Okay, that's more than usual. Often during a sit, the emotional body sort of goes to rest. So we're going to do another short period, but this time you have the option to make the mental labels. Everyone heard loud and clear, the mental labels are an option. You can use them or not. However, the quality of voice, the continuity of the labels, and the precision of the languaging will help induce the 3 features of mindfulness. The continuity of the label stream guarantees more or less continuous concentration. The speaking the labels in a gentle, matter-of-fact voice induces equanimity. And the precision in the language, you know exactly what those phrases refer to. How many people noticed, that's the clarity piece. How many people noticed that more than one of these would activate at the same time? That's an excellent insight. If all three activate strongly and they freeze, you're going to get a very strong sense of limited identity. If few of them activate or none of them activate, the limited identity gets less. If they activate but they sort of turn into like a flow of energy, well, that's a flow self. That's you know, there's waves, particles, right? So that's the wave nature of self. And that's the spirit nature of self. Anybody have that sort of, it broke up into flow or vibration or something like that? Raise their hands. Okay, not so many. It takes quite, you know, you have to look through the microscope a long time to start to see the essential fluid nature of our thoughts and emotions, which is indeed the fluid nature of all of our senses. So we're now going to add some structure, do another short period of practice, and then we're going to open it up for questions, comments, and so forth. Once again, take a moment to stretch up and settle in. The straightness of the spine, not slouching, not leaning back, will help with alertness, clarity. The repose of the body opens the body, and that opens consciousness, and that induces equanimity. The posture impacts the consciousness. One of the great discoveries of the East. Now bring your attention to your inner life. Note mental image, mental talk, emotional body, or their absence. If you wish to use mental labels, we'll use the two-syllable quick labels. See in for mental image, hear in for mental talk, feel in for the emotional body, all rest for the complete deactivation of the system. When physical sounds or physical body sensations arise, let them, but in the background. They may have an impact on your thought and emotional body. Allow see in, hear in, feel in to activate or deactivate, expand, contract. Allow them to flow or freeze as they wish. Now, in a moment, we're going to still continue with this technique, but we're going to make a change. Continue to note, see in, hear in, feel in. But the change is that I would like you to slowly open your eyes. Eyes open, but awareness back. Back in the subjective world. Maybe this creates an all rest. Maybe it activates the emotional body. Continue to be aware. Even with your eyes open, you may be able to be in contact with mental images. They're usually sort of hazy, fleeting. Mental talk may activate. See in, hear in, feel in. If things disappear, fine. If everything goes restful, fine. But now your eyes are fully open. Now, the most important moment in a period of formal practice is when you transition from the practice in stillness to practice in life. In a moment, the bell will ring, but you can still keep track. Even as we move, interact, and so forth in a natural way, see if you can keep some awareness back. Monitoring your mental screen, monitoring your mental loudspeaker, monitoring your emotional body as we go about our normal activity. Okay. Now, we're going to take a couple minutes. Remain mindful. You're still seeing, hearing, and feeling, right? Going to take a couple minutes for, give you a chance to ask some questions and so forth. So, Andrea, you will manage the logistics thereof.
We have a couple of microphones that there'll be one at the front here for Elaine, and then Alan is going to take one toward the back. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I'm going to ask a question while we're waiting, Shinzen, if that's okay. So I can understand how doing this practice can cultivate insight into my own emotional state and gather information about how myself is and how myself is holding feelings in the present moment. When I'm working with others who are in a state of overwhelm, a child or a client, how can this kind of practice or my own insight be useful in that interaction?
Yeah, fantastic question. Did everyone get that? Okay, I just showed you how to track your own mind and emotional body. Now let's say you're with someone who is going through some sort of emotion. And I think you were sort of implying in the negative spectrum.
Right.
Anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, impatience, disgust, and so forth. How does this practice relate to that situation? So we have the word compassion in English. But what does the Latin roots actually mean? What does compassio actually mean? What does con mean? C-O-N or C-O-M in Latin? With or share. And what is passio? Well, it's passion, it's feeling, right? So compassion means to share the feeling. So when we're with someone who happens to be going through emotional distress, that means they're going through negative pictures, negative tapes, and dysphoric emotional body sensations. So that's the pain that they're going through. When we're around that person, our image, talk, and emotional body resonate with that. It sets off inside us, see and hear and feel it. Now, this is the essence. This is the essence of compassion. This is what I'm about to say. Share the pain, not the suffering. And how do you do that? When you have a mindful experience of the pain imposed upon you by the presence of other people's suffering, it means that you have a full experience of that. Their pain resonates inside you. You experience it mindfully. Remember I said more poignant but less problematic? You experience that with great poignancy, but as just a flow of energy. It is not problematic in your body and mind. Therefore, it doesn't cause you suffering. It doesn't cause you to bum out, burn out, or freak out. So it's good for you. You're purifying your consciousness by, in psychology, it's important to know whether the stuff is endogenous or exogenous. But in spiritual practice, it's important not to need to know that. And of course, so you have both sides, right? So it doesn't matter. If it comes from the outside, you process it, guess what? That not only builds your skills, but that purifies your own consciousness. Because what's on the surface percolates down into the subconscious. So by you picking this up from them and you having habitual mindfulness so that you're able to experience the imposed suffering or the imposed pain without suffering, you're actually purifying your own consciousness. At the same time, you are subtly, what your nervous system is doing is subtly training that other person's nervous system to do the same. So you're giving a silent teaching by the way that you're processing this. And this is not new. Freud talked about it. I mean, it's been around. It's the nuts and bolts of therapeutic listening. But when you when you consciously and systematically train these skills, then that therapeutic listening is vastly potentiated. And eventually what you do is you walk through the world just picking up. See, that's the thing. When people first start these practices, the common report we always hear, now that I'm doing these practices, I'm so sensitive, I pick up all this stuff. And I can't relate to ordinary people anymore. They don't share my same values, okay? That's the awkward intermediate zone. That's the spiritual juvenile speaking. Well, you have to be a teenager before you're grown up. But when you grow up, you will love picking up the poison and pain of the world. You'll relish it because you'll know this secret magic that you're capable of doing just by being around those people.
So can I give you an example?
Yes.
I'm going to get you really concrete for my benefit. If others benefit, I'd be glad, but this is for me. So if my child, for example, is tantruming on the floor, or I have a client that's tantruming in some way, then the practice might be for me to be aware, wow, I'm having an emotional reaction in my body. through this interaction.
Or more
Or I'm
broadly.
having mental images about me being a bad parent or whatever, and I'm having this talk perhaps. And just me being able to have that foundational practice, then I can use it in the moment to be able to process it so I don't get sucked into or escalate that suffering.
It's exactly
but I'm
the
able to
case.
be present with it. And are you saying in terms of the modeling that even my being able to stay present with it and to not allow it to escalate within me, it somehow models that processing to the other party?
That's correct. Subtly, but subtle is significant. It builds up with time.
Great.
So basically, if you can process it, then you suffer less. You still feel the pain, so you're motivated and directed, but you suffer less so that you're not driven and distorted. So the actions become more appropriate. So it just works well. Now, the trick, though, is to do enough formal practice so that the mindfulness skills are second nature. Because when stuff happens in life, you sort of have to take care of business, right? So that's why I always say that mindful awareness practices elevate your base level of mindfulness. So as your base level of mindfulness is elevated, you'll go into that automatically, even though you're just sort of taking care of business. Those circuits have been trained to do that on their own. Like driving a car, becomes second nature.
Thank you.
Okay.
So any questions from the audience? Anybody want to ask something of clarification? There's one in the back there. And if you can ask the question into the microphone, and then I'm going to repeat it.
Just a question about the tracking of the different sensory states. What I found is that basically feel in was the most predominant, and every once in a while I get a see in or a hear in. And I didn't know really which one to follow because I was sort of curious about the other two, but the feeling was mostly present, but every once in a while I would leave it and check out what was happening with see in or hear in. So I don't know if I was doing that the way it should be done, or I should just pick one and stick with it, or am I
Okay.
flitting about too much?
Yeah.
Or?
I'm going to
It's hard to
thank you.
repeat.
So
Okay.
I'm going to paraphrase. I think the question was about if one of either see in, feel in, or hear in is predominant, is that okay? Is it okay to have a preference in the moment or for one to predominate in the moment? Or should one intentionally try to shift one's focus to the other two states?
Essentially, what you're asking is a question about the strategy of the focus technique. And there are literally dozens and dozens of different mindful awareness practices. And they will have different emphasis. So what I can do is I can answer that question with regards to this technique, but there might be other techniques that would give you a different answer because they're set up in a different way. The quick answer to your question is you're all going to get this tomorrow, my complete contact sheet. At the bottom, you'll see 5 ways to know yourself, a manual of basic mindfulness. If you go to that manual and you go to the chapter on the way of thought and emotion, and you look at the technique called focus in, it will answer that question. Okay? So the quick answer is you let your attention broadly float among them. Whatever interests you, you sort of focus on that. But the more detailed answer you can find in the manual.
Another question? There's one up here.
Could you enlarge upon your comment that when somebody is sharing or we are witnessing someone's pain, that we feel it as a flow of energy through us? I'm thinking in terms of how sometimes at the end of a day when we've seen or sat with many stressed people, I feel that I've absorbed some of that stress, and I'm not sure how to deflect it other than to do something physical, go for a swim, kind of rejuvenate myself by removing myself from all those stressors.
So the question was about asking for clarifications of Shinzen's concept about bearing witness to suffering as being present with a flow of energy, and how to you, if you work in healthcare and education, you're often bearing witness to suffering hours on end in a day, and how does one absorb that in a way that's going to be healthy and not depleting?
Okay, good. There's actually several parts to your question. And I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to try to give you the executive summary. Over and over again, you've heard me say, if we're serious about this practice, we're going to actually do a little bit of practice day to day, and every once in a while do retreats. So what that does is that elevates your base level of mindful awareness. That's your base level of concentration, clarity, and equanimity. As your base level gets elevated, you will be able to automatically be metabolizing things as they come to you. So that gets taken care of, and there's less aftershock. So your base level of mindfulness, a mindful awareness, is how clear, concentrated, and equanimous you are as you're going about ordinary life, including listening to clients, and you're not particularly trying to be mindful, okay? So the one part of the answer to your question is, well, if you do enough practice, those skills will be on automatic pilot as you're receiving the stuff from the world, and so it gets metabolized automatically, and you don't get that residue at the end of the day. If you do get the residue at the end of the day, then apply a technique, okay? Now, I just gave you one technique. The technique I just gave you was to deconstruct, to break things down into the components, and then ultimately see that the atoms themselves are just wave functions. That's a deconstructive technique. It is very powerful. It's a turn towards strategy. And it can not only deconstruct negative emotions, it can deconstruct the whole structure of the suffering self. And that's called liberation or enlightenment. However, it has probably occurred to you that this is not the only basic strategy that could be used, focus strategy that could be used for dealing with emotions. You just alluded to a couple others. There's a lot of things you can do. Basically, you can turn towards or you can turn away. This evening, I just showed you how to turn towards. But it is absolutely just as valid to turn away, to focus on positive states and nurture those, to anchor out in physical sights, physical sounds, to find restful states and focus on those. That's exactly why I call it 5 ways to know yourself. So don't think for a moment that this turn towards and deconstruct is the only basic strategy for working with thoughts and emotions. I just named several others. However, I would emphatically point out to you that whether you elect to turn towards and deconstruct, or whether you elect to replace negative content with positive content, or whether you elect to regulate by down-regulating and finding restful states, or whether you elect to anchor by focusing out on physical sights or physical sounds, all of these strategies involve the same core skill set. They all, in one way or another, require concentration, clarity, and equanimity, and they all, in one way or another, build those core skills. Once you see this, you have a unifying paradigm for an enormous range of practices that on the surface seem quite disparate, if not contrary. Okay? So that's the executive summary. So we're almost done. As I mentioned, you will receive in an email my full contact sheet. Here you will find my article, What is Mindfulness? Where I give an attempt to create a fine-grained and rigorous definition of mindfulness, and I also give explanatory mechanisms in detail as to how these 3 core skills deliver the goodies that I mentioned: reduce suffering, elevate fulfillment, self-knowledge at the deepest level, positive behavior change, and a spirit of love and service. So the What is Mindfulness article, that's free online. You'll also find Basic Mindfulness, a Modern Synthesis. That is a description of the mindful awareness system that I created. It is the first system, probably the only system, that was created specifically for the use of scientists. It was designed to be science-friendly. And that's why places like Harvard and Yale are interested in it, because they recognize that its ontology of sensory experience and the wide range of contrasting approaches that it offers is just ideal for fMRI research and for other kinds of basic science and clinical application research. So the article, Basic Mindfulness, a Modern Synthesis, gives the principles that I followed in creating this very modern, science-friendly system of mindful awareness. So that's a free article. You'll also find my main Basic Mindfulness website, which is basicmindfulness.com or .org. It works the same. If you're interested in learning my techniques, we deliver them every month via telephone. You don't have to travel anywhere. It's a very good delivery system. Hundreds of people from around the world call in on the second weekend of every month, and that you can do Skype. It's really cheap, and anyone can learn mindfulness that way very conveniently. You'll also find links to 2 other programs that are very related to your professional interests. My system has an internet-based, currently available application for the classroom, and that's at the Modern Mindfulness link, and you could look that up. And also, these techniques are being used for training healthcare workers, frontline workers, and their managers at the Center for Conscious Care, and that's here in Canada. And actually, that's Peter is the man. Peter, if you would wave your hand. This is Peter Marks. His contact information is here, and he can provide you with programs. If you like my techniques and you like my approach, well, he's got a currently available and very tested program that worked at Rigel, is that it? Yeah. Yeah. So you can check that out. So there's all these free goodies for you, and we are done.